Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to tonight's Bible study live, and so glad to have you joining us. Feel free to give us a hello in the chat if you're here with us live, and if you're watching this later, feel free to comment down below or say hello there. We'll go ahead and start with our introductions, and then yeah, we'll talk about like what we're going to talk about today. So my name is Micah Melody. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am the program coordinator here at TMC.
And I'm Peter. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm the development coordinator.
So we're so glad to have you tonight. And before we get started, we want to just share a few announcements of things we have coming up. So this, first of all, this Sunday is Trans Day of Remembrance, and so on November 20th, this Sunday, we're going to have a Trans Day of Remembrance prayer service on this YouTube channel. So you can find us in the same spot. And it's going to be this Sunday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. And it's going to be a time of remembrance and just a prayer. So feel free to come, and we'll be lighting candles in remembrance of trans folks that we've lost. And feel free to come and offer up names. And we'll be just gathering in prayer and worship. So that'll be on Sunday. And then on November 30th, we are going to have our upcoming November workshop, World History Before We Were Trans. And I'm going to post a link in the chat for us. We're going to be joined by Dr. Kit Ham, who will be reflecting on their recent book, Before We Were Trans, which calls for a new approach to trans history that is communal and anti-racist. And they'll be sharing stories about global gender diversity from West Africa to North America. And we're really, really excited to have this opportunity to learn from them. And I hope you can join us. Tickets are $15 or pay as you can. And we'll be recording the workshop for ticket holders. If you are really interested, but you can't make it, we'll make sure to get the video sent out to you. So yeah, those are kind of all the announcements that we have before we get started. And yeah, so for our Bible study live, today we're looking at Mark 5, verses 21 through 43. And this is the story of Jairus, or Jairus's daughter, and the woman with the issue of blood. And as we were talking about before we got started, Peter and I were kind of talking about how we even talk about this, and the language that is used to talk about this passage varies in various different scriptures and different traditions. And it's really, we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Just to give a little overview of our schedule for the evening. So we're going to read through piece by piece of the text and discuss it. If you have something that's on your mind or a question, feel free to put it in the chat as we read it or as we're talking, and we can dig into that. Otherwise, we'll just take turns going through some of the things that Peter and I have observed, and asking questions for us all to answer, and then we'll close with some closing thoughts or questions. And so as we get started, before Peter reads the passage, I wanted to give just a little bit of information about Mark as a whole, the book of Mark. So Mark is very intentional with details. Like Mark is very specific about what he keeps in and when he writes. And the original book of Mark was actually meant to be oratory. It was something that would be told and heard in a city square or in a synagogue. And so this was something that was meant to really capture the reader's attention. And so it had to be very concise. So anything that's left in there and anything that's there, Mark puts in very intentionally. So as Peter reads this, and as we kind of go through, just invite us to think about what are the details, like what details stand out to you specifically about the women in this passage, and what details stand out to you about Jesus's interaction with those women. Yeah, so just pay a specific attention to any details, as well as just what questions that you have of what's going on. So Peter, would you mind reading this for us?
Yeah, of course. I'm going to be reading from the Message translation, which is a different translation than we often use. But as we were talking about before we got started, Micah, just that whole oral tradition and the fact that this is such a well-told story, it seemed to lend itself really well to that more like conversational translation. So that's why I decided to go with that one today. But as always, we're really interested to hear about what translations you're reading in and like what the differences are, what words are translated differently and what that might mean about how the passage is being interpreted by the translator. So please like share with us those things in the chat too. So this is Mark 5:21 through 43 from the Message translation. After Jesus crossed over by boat, a large crowd met him at the seaside. One of the meeting place leaders named Jairus came. When he saw Jesus, he fell to his knees beside himself as he begged, "My dear daughter is at death's door. Come and lay hands on her so she will get well and live." Jesus went with him, the whole crowd tagging along, pushing and jostling him. A woman who had suffered a condition of hemorrhaging for 12 years, a long succession of physicians had treated her badly, taking all her money and leaving her worse off than before, had heard about Jesus. She slipped in from behind and touched his robe. She was thinking to herself, "If I can put a finger on his robe, I can get well." The moment she did it, the flow of blood dried up. She could feel the change and knew her plague was over and done with. At the same moment, Jesus felt energy discharging from him. He turned around to the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said, "What are you talking about? With this crowd pushing and jostling you, you're asking, 'Who touched me?' Dozens have touched you." But he went on asking, looking around to see who had done it. The woman, knowing what had happened, knowing she was the one, stepped up in fear and trembling, knelt before him, and gave him the whole story. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, you took a risk of faith, and now you're healed and whole. Live well, live blessed, be healed of your plague." While he was still talking, some people came from the leader's house and told him, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" Jesus overheard what they were talking about and said to the leader, "Don't listen to them, just trust me." He permitted no one to go in with him except Peter, James, and John. They entered the leader's house and pushed their way through the gossips looking for a story and neighbors bringing in casseroles. Jesus was abrupt. "Why all this busybody grief and gossip? The child isn't dead, she's sleeping." Provoked to sarcasm, they told him he didn't know what he was talking about. But when he had sent them all out, he took the child's father and mother along with his companions and entered the child's room. He clasped the girl's hand and said, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, get up." After that, she was up and walking around. This girl was 12 years of age. They, of course, were all beside themselves with joy. He gave them strict orders that no one was to know what had taken place in that room. Then he said, "Give her something to eat."
Thanks, Peter. I really love that. Wow, there were so many little moments in there that just like are just. I was reading along in the NRSV, and there's just so many moments that are just slightly different, and that really does. That's what I love about reading in different like translations. It really does kind of freshen the story. So thank you for reading that for us in the Message. So this kind of a little bit of a longer passage, and so just to help us kind of walk through it, we're going to break it down into different sections, and just talk about things that we're observing, or and questions that we have as well. And so the first section that we're going to look at are verses 21 through 24. And so if you would like to put in the chat, like what are some of the things that you've kind of noticed in this section? So verses 21 and 24. And as you're doing that, we'll talk a little bit about like kind of things that we're noticing. So one thing that immediately I noticed was Jairus, like I was just trying to picture the scene. So as you were reading it, like I liked the message because it was kind of really giving this sort of chaotic feel of what's going on with the crowds. And so I'm just imagining this loud area and all of these people kind of jostling about, trying to get to Jesus, trying to follow Jesus. and all of a sudden you have this man, Jairus, who is a leader like a religious leader in the synagogue, who's just running and basically falling on the ground and pleading with Jesus. And so I'm like imagining how loud that must be in order to actually, and like how visually disruptive even just that on top of an already chaotic, visually like disruptive time. Yeah. So also I wanted to say welcome, Lily. I saw your thing in the chat while Peter was reading. Welcome. Peter, do you have any things that you're noticing or that you are questions that you have in this area?
Yeah, it's definitely very chaotic, isn't it? It feels like it would take, like you would feel as a member of that crowd that it would take a lot to get Jesus' attention. And it doesn't seem like Jairus hesitates. There's almost a little, it feels a little bit like this, someone who's used to being heard in his approach, because he just like goes straight to Jesus and is like, listen, here's my situation. Like, come and do this for me. It's not exactly entitlement, but it's definitely like, there's an expectation that you will listen to me. I feel comfortable going to this person who is, considered an authority by this crowd that I'm surrounded by, and like kind of coming with my own like place of authority in the community. That's just the impression that I get of Jairus here.
Yeah, I like that you brought up the almost a sense of I'm known, you're going to do this for me. Like there is this if Jesus is a revered teacher and these people are following him, like this massive crowd, and there's almost this expectation, of course, that I would, you would pay attention.
Yeah.
And I mean, we see that like my version says one of the leaders of the synagogue. And so like he has probably a well-known figure within the community. That in itself just tells us a lot about who he is. Yeah, so I'm also really intrigued that like his request that he's asking for his daughter. And I love the detail here. And this will be, and I just want to point this out because I think this is, as we'll see later on in the passage, I think it's pretty relevant. He says, my little daughter is at the point of death. And like the fact that he's like naming that it's like, there's this level of compassion and care. And of course, like I can imagine like like for a parent to just be feeling that level of desperation. So who knows if you would have approached Jesus beforehand without that, but there's definitely a level of desperation and expectation.
Yeah, for sure. It's like, you will hear me.
Yeah.
Because it's my daughter. Yeah. Yeah, the translation I read says my dear daughter. I like because it's just that but it kind of conveys the same thing, just this like preciousness of this child,
Yeah, definitely. Are there any other observations that anyone has? Feel free to put any observations in the chat. And if not, we'll move on to the next session. This is a small little section, and there's some details here, and that I think are really help us to see the whole of the passage. And so just let's keep those in mind as well. Does anyone have any? Oh, go for it.
Oh, I think it's, partly the message translation highlights these things, but I always like to see the moments of humor or like kind of wit in the different gospel writers. Like, I think it's kind of funny. Like, Jesus went with him, the whole crowd tagging along. Like, it's just kind of like a funny image. Like, okay, I'm gonna go help this person out. Bye, see you all later. And then they all just come like, nope, we're gonna come with. Like, just kind of comical, and also I don't know, you almost feel sorry for Jesus. There are other parts of the gospels where he kind of will withdraw to be alone, and I just, as an introvert myself, I just cannot imagine like living the way he did and having this constant crowd of people around him all the time, when it seemed like he was someone who really did value like having solitude sometimes.
That's a great observation, and actually make me think of a question just on the spot. What do you think they were expecting? Like, why did the crowd tag along? Like, what was their anticipation? Are they just wanting to follow And what do you all think? Like, what are they? I don't know if we can have the answer to this because it's not directly in the text, but um, oh, great question, Lily. So this story, and Lily's question is, do we discuss what precedes the story? So
Mm,
let's, that's a really great question. So if we look at Mark 5 as a whole, immediately before this is a story of Jesus crossing the Sea of Galilee to the region of the Gerasenes, and he helping and basically casting out demons from a man, and in sending them into the pigs. And so there's this kind of really jarring story of this man being restored and healed. And so I think that's a great point because it does give like context as well to this story of healing. Um, Thank you for
yes,
the question.
even in answer to that, like what is the crowd hoping for or expecting? Like if he's been doing these kind of um I don't know if showy is the right word, but really like, like these miracles or these like acts of healing that are kind of shocking or really public, which is kind of it, because this is the messianic secret gospel, right? So this is the one where he's constantly like, tell no one, like keep a lid on it, and then like it's not working very well. Like
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Interestingly, in the previous passage, he actually says, "Go and tell what God has done for you." So there is, and but and there's this interesting play between like don't. Lily says, and that he was asked to leave from the area after healing that demon possessed man by the others in the region. Yes, he was. Jesus was the villagers were afraid and basically said, "Please leave." And so it's interesting that there is this kind of contrast between the people of the region in the previous story being like, no, we don't want this, and other people in the here being like, we want to see what Jesus does. So there's a really, thank you for bringing that up. That's a really great contrast. And well, why don't we move on to the next part of the passage, and we're going to look at verses 25 through 29. So this is on my in the NRSV. For me, it's now there was a woman who had been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years, and I think your mentioned like what was how did the message write that?
it says a woman who had suffered a condition of hemorrhaging for 12 years.
Yeah. And so I wanted to just bring up a little bit, or we were talking about how there is this like way that a lot of translations and churches, and there is like this, like, how do we talk about this? One, how do we talk about this respectfully and make sure that I think previously growing up, I used to hear like her referenced as quote unquote, the bleeding woman, which just seems to equate her with her condition and the thing that she's been suffering, and that feels like really dehumanizing. And but at the same time there is this way of like of like the awkwardness around the conversation about how we talk about menstrual bleeding, as well as like that kind of awkwardness that's there, that I think we even see that within the passage itself. And so the way that she's approaching Jesus secretively. And Peter, I think you were meant in your notes, like you were kind of talking a little bit, or like noting a little bit about the idea of being unclean. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is something that comes up a lot, right, in different stories about Jesus, but like there were these really clear ideas of what was considered clean and what was considered unclean. Um, and, that were sort of part of the framework insisted on by religious authorities at that time. Um, and one of the things that was considered very unclean was menstrual blood. And so, a woman who was like in the middle of her menstrual period would be considered unclean, would not be able to like uh it's like she couldn't even enter into the temple courts, is that right? Like she couldn't go into sacred spaces basically because she was considered unclean until she had um like completed the ritual purification. um
Yeah.
So this is, it's kind of, it's very audacious of this woman, like with this condition, who knew that she would be considered unclean, and that if she touched Jesus, she'd be like, you know, be considered to be passing that uncleanness on to Jesus, still like made the choice to do that. And then Jesus' response, and really his like refusal to acknowledge those categories, like um he kind of turns all of that on its head. And I think that's, you know, it just one of the most noteworthy things about this story.
Yeah, definitely. I 100% agree, and I see Lily's comments in the chat. If we frame this as she was unclean, she basically lived the last 12 years as an outcast of society, and people most likely wanted to avoid her to prevent becoming unclean themselves. Absolutely. The When I was looking at cross references for kind of this type of understanding of being ritually unclean, it brought me to Leviticus 15, 19 through 30, which is kind of where some of the regulations here are. And especially in verse 15. So this is from the NRSV. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her menstrual impurity, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness, as in the days of her impurity, she shall be unclean. Um, and um, and so like I think that kind of idea of just the uncleanliness about also in those like in 15 Leviticus 15, 19 through 30, there's also regulations that anything that she touches will become unclean, and anything that touches the thing that becomes unclean, anyone who touches that becomes unclean. And so there is this way that her getting into the crowd and her kind of pushing every single person she's touching is becoming ritually unclean in this context. And so I think that really does speak to her, just her like desire and her desperation. And also too, if you look at I mean, the fact that like this woman had tried so many different things, like, and she had in my verse 26 it says she had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better but rather grew worse. And so like, I mean, yeah, imagine that for 12 years. And yeah, as you pointed out, Lily, I think, yeah, there's very much um very much so that like that she would be unable to have like physical touch with like people for 12 years. Like there's that. She couldn't enter into the temple because of being ritually unclean, which is where it was considered God's presence was dwelling. So like that's a lot.
Yeah, and I think, it's one of those things, like as I was reading it and sort of digging into that idea, it just has a lot of resonance, again, for queer and trans folks, I think, of like feeling that reality of being considered in some way unclean, or
Yeah.
not welcome, or not able to enter into holy, being told that we can't enter into sacred spaces, like that. So that just felt very, um yeah, that just felt significant, like from a like queer reading as well.
That's a really good kind of application and kind of queer application of this. And that's a very relatable experience. And I don't know if anyone in the chat is, I see there's like some conversation in the chat too, and I want to address that too, which I love the kind of the dialogue going on in the chat, and we're going to get there. And I also would just like, as I, I feel like that's a relatable experience for many queer and trans folks of
Mhm.
feeling that sense of I mean, the idea of like, well, God, God loves you, but like, you can't, love the sinner, hate the sin, like sort of messaging. That is like a sense of, that is like a modern version in a way of like that idea of being unclean and not being able to enter into these church spaces.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Well, I see this conversation, and I think that's like, and I love your question, Eden. Eden says, sometimes I feel like Jesus is angry here that someone has touched him. Does anyone else feel that way? And I think that that's a great. We're going to get to that passage like now, or that section. We've got verse 30 through 34 next, and so like this is where Jesus kind of feels like he calls her out. Like that's kind of intense. I mean, she's approaching secretly and he's like, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are like, "Well, we're in a crowd. Of course people are going to touch you." And I love the sass there and the sarcasm. I think that's really funny.
Really funny. That's really funny.
But like Jesus is like, "No, no, no. Who touched me? Like I felt power go from me. Who is this?" Um yeah, so why do you think, I mean, I see this conversation, like even saying like, does anyone else feel like that Jesus was angry, or is it just observance by him that he had been touched? And I see Tom says, good point, Eden. I hadn't considered that. Personally, it reads to me as just noticing because power went out from him. Um, uh, and Eden says, perhaps I was making a point that he's not made unclean. Ooh, that's an interesting interpretation of like, look, I'm not actually, and look, I am the one who makes clean. Oh, I like that.
Mhm.
Lily says, I think he's just making an observation. I think he wanted to talk with the woman. I think these are really great things. I like, so I think that was a question that I had in this is like, why do you think it was so important that Jesus called her out publicly? Like, why take the moment to, and even to address the disciples sass and be like, no, I want, this is important to me.
Mhm.
um any other thoughts too? Like I love these interpretations, these are great. What do you think, Peter?
I mean, one of the interpretations that I saw that was really meaningful to me was pointing out that Jesus allowed her to interrupt. Like he was going somewhere else, right?
Mm,
But she was important. So he allowed like when she touched him, that was like everything else stopped for him and he focused his attention on her, which to me is like really moving because it's like, you know, all these other like competing priorities or you know this or even kind of more specifically the fact that he was on his way to address a need from someone who had like a position of power and privilege in the community, still a very real need and he was, you know, on his way to, you know, address that need, but the fact that he stopped and focused all his attention on her. And I read an interpretation that talked about that as Jesus uh, uh, recognizing the priority of the marginalized,
mm,
and that it's like this reversal of priorities. It's like, you know, you would think that he would focus his attention on the person who had the most influence and power, but instead his attention is focused specifically on someone, again, who is an outcast, who doesn't have that power and privilege, who um, is even unclean, so that if he engages with her, he's participating in that uncleanness. Like, but that's where his priority lies, and that's where his focus and attention goes. So that's like how that was the interpretation that was really meaningful to me. Is that like he allowed himself to be interrupted by her.
yeah, I love that interpretation. The idea of interruption, and even just the dynamically in the story, like the
Mhm.
story is talking about, it's like we're talking about Jairus, like this crowd, and then the crowd's following Jesus as he's going with Jairus. And then all of a sudden, just the story completely shifts. And then it's this interaction with this woman who is unnamed. And we've got this like named leader of the community and this like, who is like, please heal my daughter. And then this woman who is completely unnamed. And all of a sudden the action just stops while Jesus is just like, no, like I need to talk to her. And I love that.
Yeah.
Um, Also, hello. Hi, Isaac. Hi, Golden Heart. Good to see you in the chat. Um, and I wondered if you wanted to share a little bit about what you found about, like, even this, just the structure, literarily, like how this is structured to kind of give focus.
Yeah, I feel like you were saying that the actual the sort of this the way the story is written kind of encourages us towards that interpretation. It's like it is structured as an interruption, and as it's got that sandwich structure, right? So it's like the beginning and the end are the Jairus story, but in the middle we've got this other story that again, like structurally interrupts, and just sort of, so that seems to kind of emphasize that further of like, this is important. It's important enough to stop the story, you know.
Totally. For folks that may not be aware about what Peter's talking about, like the sandwich structure, there's a common literary structure within writing around this time, and it's known as a chiasm. And a chiasm is essentially where you take two things that are like parallel or the same, and then in the middle of those things you stick something, and then that becomes like the emphasis, or like the thing that is really important. And so in this story, we have at the very beginning Jairus coming, please heal my daughter, and then at the very end, we'll see later that's like Jesus, like the moment when Jesus is going with Jairus and healing Jairus's daughter. But in the middle, there's this like disruptive kind of experience of Jesus really focusing on this woman. So just even literally, like within the idea of a chiasm, there is like this prioritization of this woman, and I really like that.
I like the word that you use, Micah. I think that's what's happening, is that Jesus is disrupting, like disrupting convention, systems of power, expectations, of like where his attention is best spent. Like that's just, that seems like what's going on here.
I see in the chat, Tom says, also, even though this is obviously a different context, I like how Jesus doesn't let other people dismiss his experience. It's like a reminder to stay true to ourselves. I like that. Yeah. Yes, the last shall be first. Yeah, definitely. There's this prior, she's literally, as was kind of pointed out by Lily earlier, she's been an outcast of the society and has been like on the outskirts, and Jesus is totally prioritizing her, and she is being healed first. And that is, it is a really beautiful thing happening in this passage.
Yeah, and again, oh, sorry, go ahead. Is it
no, go for it.
Just like coming back to the the queer reading of this story, like that is just very, it's healing, to kind of like think about Jesus turning towards me as a queer and trans person, in the moment when I feel most unclean or feel most rejected or feel like I'm not worthy of his attention, and hearing Jesus like saying, as he's saying to this woman, like, you're the most important thing right now, like you have my full attention, and that's just very, just very kind of healing idea.
Yeah, I think you found out like a cool quote from a resource that you found that was kind of touching on this last will be first and the prioritization of the marginalized. Would you like to share that? I can post the link in the chat for folks.
Yeah, I'll read it. Within the family of Israel, these daughters, talking about both the woman and Jairus's daughter, represent the advantaged and the impoverished, respectively. Because of such inequity, the body politic of the synagogue is on the verge of death. Jesus' healing journey must, however, take a necessary detour that stops to listen to the pain of the excluded. Only when the outcast woman is restored to daughterhood can the daughter of the synagogue also be restored to life. That is the faith the privileged must learn from the poor. This story thus functions to show a central characteristic of the sovereignty of God, which Jesus will later also tell. The last will be first, and the least will be greatest.
Yeah, that's great. Where's that from?
It's from a resource called a website called Radical Discipleship. And let's see, who is the author is Ched Myers.
Awesome. Yeah, so I put the link in the chat if you want to check out, if anyone wants to check out more on that interpretation of this passage. And I love that, and that the last shall be first and the least shall be greatest. Those kind of ideas, like that's a common theme throughout the book of Mark, and it kind of keeps happening. And later the disciples are arguing, with Jesus about who's the greatest among them, and Jesus is like, whoever would be the greatest must become the servant of all. Like, and so like I think those themes of like that kind of reversal of power is really powerful, and we definitely see that here. Mm.
Mhm.
Well, why don't we, I know we're kind of, I want to make sure we have a time to talk about the rest of the passage as well as some things to look at the whole passage. So why don't we look at, I'm going to actually change our grouping. We were going to look at 35 through 40, but why don't we just look at kind of this next section of verses 35 through the end. And so um, this is from while he was still speaking, some people came from the synagogue leader's house to say, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further, through the end of the and so yeah, what things did you notice about now that the story is kind of, this interruption has happened, the woman has been kind of, Jesus has engaged with this woman, and really been like, I want to hear your whole story. I'm going to take and pause. And one thing I notice, please feel free to share. What do you observe? What are the things that you're noticing in this part? There has been a cost for Jesus to stop and engage fully with this woman. Like, it's not just like he engaged, like there was the time crunch, and he took this moment, and the cost we see of like Jairus's daughter is apparently dead at this point. We don't really know that. I mean, Jesus later says like she's not dead, she's just sleeping. But like for the crowd, for the people, what that must have felt like is, I just think about like for Jairus, like why in the world are we stopping for this woman when my daughter is about to die? Like that feeling of just, that's really painful. Like, and just like feeling that. Yeah, what other things, what do you notice? Like, do you have any questions about this section? What about you, Peter?
Yeah, we do, like, we shift our perspective back to Jairus then, and it's like, we kind of forget about him during that central part, and he's standing there, and his daughter is at home dying. That's his experience. That's what he's you know believes to be true, and yeah, I mean, I think it would feel very hurtful, and as though you know your needs were being neglected, or like you came in second place here. That would be a really hard thing.
Yeah, I think that kind of, especially when it's, your daughter's life, someone that you really care about. Yeah, I see Tom says like it's almost like another interruption, an interruption to the interruption. It's absolutely jarring.
Yeah.
Like we're interrupted, like we're going in this place, and then all of a sudden the kind of interruption is then we're brought back to, quote unquote, brought back to reality with
Hmm.
this news that his daughter is dead. Like that's like, I mean, if you think about that in like a kind of cinematography, I love thinking about things this way. That's like that's what a jump cut, going from one
Hmm.
scene and all of a sudden you're like in this next scene and your daughter is dead. So it's yeah, that is definitely another interruption. I see Eden says they have a limited perspective on his healing power. Huh, like I really like that. Do you want to say any more about what you mean by that? An understandable perspective, but a limited one. I feel that I often have to put limits or boundaries on what God can do. Right.
Hmm.
So yeah, definitely with talking about with the people who assume that Jairus's daughter is dead, there is this sense of, well, this can't happen anymore. It's kind of hopeless. And I just think that's really powerful in seeing like hope in situations that may feel hopeless. Like I'm sure we can all put ourselves in similar in like, or have experiences where that might feel hopeless, or things have seemingly. Sorry, what were you gonna say, Peter?
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, where things might seemingly have died, or we feel like things are have we've lost hope and things have died to us in our perspective. That's really powerful.
Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty understandable response, right? It's not even like I think this passage is really cool in the amount of empathy that it asks from us. I mean, like that, those shifts in perspective where we're kind of asked to see from all these different points of view. Um, and like my response to that is like, you know, uh, feeling almost like a sense of resentment of being asked to have more faith when it's so there's no actual reason to believe that you know, like change is possible in that instance. And that just feels relatable to me of like, why are you asking me to have faith? Like this is clearly over, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I feel like that, like, and I feel like that happens to me routinely. Just that
mhm,
feeling of, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. There's no way that, and knowing, looking back now, I'm like, I can't believe I felt like that. But like in the moment, it's very relatable. And I
yeah,
see Eden says, like when Jesus dies, there's also hopelessness. And then the disciples have difficulty with the hope. And
yeah,
yeah, I think it's that feeling of, it's that, kind of thinking about it's the Saturday between the death and the resurrection. It's that feeling of being in the middle of, and we're in just kind of waiting, and it doesn't feel like there can be any hope, but there is. And I think that's a really powerful encouragement. Thanks for
yeah.
bringing that up, Eden.
And that line, why bother the teacher anymore, stuck out to me too. Cause it's
Mm,
like, that also seems like a relatable feeling of like, well, why should I talk to God about this? You know, it's hopeless.
yeah,
And it kind of like that hopelessness kind of encourages us to like sever connection, which is not what we want to do. We want to stay connected, but
yeah.
it's an easy like temptation to fall into of like, well, you know, I'm just
And
gonna
that's a
not be the teacher anymore, you know.
yeah, that's a hard thing also to hear, like from Jesus. Do not be afraid. Like, how do you just not be afraid? Only
Yeah.
believe. So,
He gets
like,
it a lot, and it's like, okay, I'll work on that.
okay, Jesus.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's encouraging, but also I do think that it's encouraging in a human, humanizes the challenge with finding hope sometimes. But it's also, there is hope. And that's a choice that we can, like, a way that we can, I don't know if it's always like an easy choice, and it's definitely not, but there is that, like, only like there's a choice to believe. So
Yeah, I feel a little bit of resistance to that, honestly, sometimes. Like that hope is a choice, or belief is a choice. You know,
yeah.
I think um I think hope being a practice is more it like is
Mm,
uh, a phrase that is more helpful to me, because um like feeling like the entire responsibility for my connection to God like lies with me is just hard, um
yeah,
it feels like an impossible thing to ask of me sometimes,
yeah,
um but sort of like practicing hope like seems like something that's more manageable because it can be done in kind of smaller increments.
yeah.
you know
And then I think we see that here because Jesus still goes, like, there is that the presence of God is still there. So it's like, and Jairus is still invited in. And so there is this practice and it's very embodied with Jesus in this moment. Um,
yeah.
Another thing I noticed in this section is that Jesus is very private with bringing people in. Like, it says that Jesus only takes Peter, James, and John. And then later on, when after the people are like, the child is like, after Jesus says, child's not dead but sleeping, and the crowd gathered laughs at him, he takes the child's parents, and then Peter, James, and John, and everyone else is like outside. And how much of a contrast that is to the previous scene of healing with the woman before, of like, it's happened, and she actually approaches Jesus in private, and Jesus is like, wait a second, I'm going to make this public. And all of a sudden you have Jairus, who at the very beginning is approaching Jesus in a very public way, and Jesus is like, wait a second, I'm going to make this private. So, like, why do you all think that? What do you think about the privacy? Or like, why is Jesus kind of making this a specific, like, I'm going to make sure that this is a private moment? Anyone have thoughts in the chat? I see also Ginny says, I like the practicing hope. I think through experience of having come through the hard time helps develop the possibility of hope the next time. I like that a lot. Does anyone have any thoughts on the kind of idea of like the privacy or of why Jesus might do that? Yeah, absolutely. It's a quite a contrast with the conversation with the woman. Do you have any thoughts, Peter? Or
It's just, I guess it makes me think about Jesus being really aware of individual needs. It's not like a one size fits all approach to healing. It's like what is needed in this circumstance with this person, you know, um, which I kind of like. And also, he has no room for like people that are there to just sensationalize it or gossip or like all of this energy that's being brought in. He just pushes all of that um, away, kind of to yeah, just give. It seems like a kindness, to this family who's grieving.
yeah, I mean, it is creating space for grief. Like,
Mhm.
yeah. Um, I see some comments from Tom. Maybe Jesus felt like the people weren't open to the healing, so they got thrown out, so to speak. Yeah, it's kind of similar to what you're saying, Peter. Of like maybe Jesus is recognizing that they need that space to grieve and to mourn, and that the crowd wasn't actually helping, so like needing to create that space.
Mhm.
Yeah, I like that. I think that is probably very much at play here. Amory says, I'm curious about the touch of his garment in the process of healing. What is that all about? That's a great question. And I think it's interesting because we see in both of these stories there is an element of touch, and that there is like it's the woman chooses to touch the garment, like Jesus's garment, and then but in the story of Jesus healing Jairus's daughter, um, Jesus literally takes her by the hand and lifts her up. But there's still an element of touch. So it's interesting that there's that parallel. Um, Jenny says, I think we as humans sometimes need something tangible, something that stimulates our senses. Ooh, I really like that. Yeah, there is definitely this element of like touch through both of these. Um, and I actually want to draw out some other parallels, just as we're kind of like looking at the thing as a whole. And I know we need to kind of bring this to a close because we're getting 10 more minutes, and so I just wanted to draw out some other parallels. So there's this kind of touch that's happening. Both of the stories. Um, Oh, I also just really quickly am noticing the chat kind of going off, so I want to make sure I capture these. Eden says, at a later time, Jesus heals without touch, but that's unusual. Um, in many other healing stories, Jesus touches the penitent. Maybe the girl, Tom says, maybe the girl also would need some space when she woke up. Ooh, that's true. Can you imagine like waking up, especially and like being surrounded by a bunch of people? That's very true.
Yeah, kind of
Um,
acknowledging the process of healing is gradual too. Like that it's not just
yeah,
a sudden thing where it's like everything's fine now. Like you need care around this process of healing.
yeah, totally. And I love that we're drawing all these out. And so just some, parallels that I was really noticing when I was looking at this. These two like two interwoven kind of stories that are here that are happening that are kind of interrupting one another. And I think that's really intentional. And there's a lot of parallels that are happening. So Jairus's daughter, Jairus calls her daughter, I think what was the message version, like my dear daughter.
Yeah.
Um, and Jesus calls the woman in the crowd daughter. Jairus's daughter is 12 years old, and the woman has had the issue of blood for 12 years. Um, Jesus lays hands on Jairus's daughter and lifts her up, and the woman has her hands reach out and touch Jesus's robe. Um, Jairus's daughter, Jesus goes to her because he's asked to, where the woman actually goes to Jesus. So there's an interesting contrast there. Jairus's daughter is at the point of death, but the woman with the issue of blood has been socially outcast, and so we can kind of think of the woman as almost being like dead to society for 12 years. Um, Jairus comes in public and is healed in private, and the woman comes in private and is healed in public. And Jairus is a synagogue leader, where the woman is exiled from the synagogue. And Jesus physically lifts with his words and in hand and says, "Arise." And the woman is also elevated, socially elevated with Jesus's words. So I'm like really curious, what do you all think about the similarities and differences in these stories? And what do you think Mark is communicating through the juxtaposition and kind of the interruption of these two stories together? Let's see, we see um, speaking of the tangible stuff, I love that Jesus is just like, give the girl something to eat. I know, I love that too. It's very much focused on the physical needs. Absolutely, it's such a practical thing, and it's really beautiful. Tom also says, "Ooh, I hadn't even thought of the 12 years parallel." Yeah, yeah. And when I first saw the 12 years parallel, I was just like, "What? That's intentional. That's absolutely intentional." And it just makes me wonder, like, what is Mark communicating? Like, do you have any thoughts, Peter?
Yeah, it's just, I mean, I'm just struck by kind of what you started with, which is how intentional all of this is and how like carefully composed this is, to draw these connections between these two stories. Yeah, and they're really one story, and just yeah, structured in this way that brings out these aspects of each of them. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. I think when I read these stories, I think a lot about um uh or I just noticed a chat from Jenny. My Jewish community suggests that the 12s may mean renewal of the 12 tribes, the whole Jewish community. Yeah, there is a lot of symbolism around the number 12, and that's like there's a lot of different things that have been said about like the 12 and the significance there. And yeah, that could be a really neat like way to think about 12 disciples, 12 years, 12 tribes. I think Savory. Yeah. Um,
Is it kind of like
the
another number that signifies completeness or like wholeness?
whole, yeah.
Is like if we're seeing this as not just like two individual people being healed, but a sort of like restoration of how
Hmm.
things should be on a more like corporate communal basis, where like the last shall be first, things are being restored to how they should be. So it's like the communities being healed, not just these two people.
Yeah, I love that, the idea of the community, that there's a restoration to rightness in community. The woman, I really think that the woman, if she had just come, and she probably would have stayed hidden because people wouldn't know that she's healed. And if she'd had that condition for 12 years, she's probably well known in the community. People probably know her as like a woman to stay away from because she's unclean. And so
Mhm.
like the fact that Jesus says like, wait a second, I'm gonna like restore you to your position in community, and I'm going to intentionally take this moment to elevate you. I love that idea of healing isn't just a physical thing. There is like a restoration that's happening in a broader sense.
Mhm.
um and I love the connection to wholeness. um yeah. So I know we're coming to a close, so I want to just kind of give us some um I want to like let me I want to give us like a moment to just like kind of gather some final thoughts and kind of close. And I just saw Tom message. I think the pulling up of the girl and the healing of the woman also shows that no matter what, whether you look for him or not, God is with us and wants to heal us. And I think that's a really beautiful kind of like a way to pull both of these together. And I was wondering, Peter, like, do you have any, as we're kind of wrapping up, do you have any kind of closing thoughts or questions or things that you would love to just kind of leave us with?
Yeah, I mean, I think just that idea of healing and what healing entails, and how healing is this holistic thing is really uh what's striking me as kind of a concluding thought. Also just kind of, yeah, thinking about, we talked a little bit before we started this about the word that's used for heal in this
Mhm.
passage, sozo, which is translated in a huge variety of ways in different like places in scripture. It can mean save, heal, rescue, preserve. And one piece of commentary I read talked about how we tend to make this distinction between salvation and health, or like
Mhm.
wholeness, healing as people. It's like there's a sort of like really spiritual type of wholeness, and then there's like other types of wholeness, physical wholeness, and like we don't tend to see them together. But I feel like this word sozo used here and these stories in general kind of bring those ideas together.
I love that. And I think it's something that we don't really realize sometimes, that the ways that like the English is translated from the Greek, like that is an interpretive choice. And I love that you're bringing out sozo, because it is, all of these things are so interconnected.
Mhm.
Um, and See, Sophia says Jesus time and time again shows that stigmas can be broken. The people that are commonly looked down on can be lifted, and those who are elevated often need quiet moments. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful kind of thing. And I think all of that kind of connects to what is the healing, what is that whole restoration, as I see Amory put it, and that idea of that sozo, that healing. And I think that's a really good thing to kind of reflect on, of like, what does it mean to seek healing? What does that look like to, and I also, what does that look like to seek healing for ourselves and for others? And I think you also mentioned, Peter, a little bit earlier, of like the kind of the complexity of like that, of how often salvation or healing gets used against the queer community or folks with disabilities, to say like, you need to be healed and saved, because and that, but like, what does it mean for us to be whole and have like our whole, for God to recognize our whole being, and like what that looks like in a restoration of the community. And I think that's really beautiful. um and I just love to personally, I think the thing that I really think about is equity in this passage. And that wholeness entails like equity of like, I think Sophia just said it really beautifully. The people that are commonly looked down on can be lifted, and those who are elevated often need those quiet moments. And sometimes that is that's a beautiful picture of equity, and happening in the scripture, and a beautiful picture of like healing, like holistic healing, that God, Jesus offers, which I think is really beautiful. Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. We are at our time, and there's so much more in this passage. There's so this, as Peter said earlier, this is so beautifully, intricately written, and there's so much here that we can continue to pull out. And I'm sure that we'll have more conversations in our community about this passage, because I think I love this passage. I've fallen in love with this every time I've read it. Um, and as we kind of close, we want to just like close with just a announcement, like a reminder that we have our Trans Day of Remembrance service this Sunday. And we will be there at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. So come join us, and that will be on this channel. So you can come to the YouTube channel, and you can find it there. And we'll also be posting the streaming link on our socials as well. And our next Bible study live will be happening on December 31st. And that will be really close during the Advent season.
21st.
21st. Thank you. Did I say 31st? I apologize. I'm like,
We're not even New Year's Eve.
no, like we're not doing that on New Year's Eve. So December 21st. And then TMC we'll be going on a programming break for the week between Christmas and New Year's. So yes, we would not even be here on the 31st, but yeah. Blessings to you all, and yeah, thank you all for participating. It's great to see, and I love to see all the conversation that's been happening in the chat as well. Blessings to you all, and we'll see you next time. Bye all.